The night of June 5, 2002 was quiet in Salt Lake City. The Smart family home rested under the calm breath of the Utah mountains, unaware that darkness had chosen their door. 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart lay asleep beside her sister Mary Catherine when a faint sound stirred the silence. A shadow crept through the open window, carrying the scent of the night and danger. A man's voice, low and commanding, ordered Elizabeth to come with him. The glint of a knife in the moonlight froze her in terror. Her sister pretended to sleep, paralyzed by fear, as Elizabeth disappeared into the darkness. The soft click of footsteps down the hallway marked the end of innocence and the beginning of a nightmare that would grip an entire nation. The next morning brought chaos. Mary Catherine ran to her parents' room, screaming Elizabeth's name. Panic exploded through the house. Police cars, flashing lights, and media vans soon swarmed the neighborhood. Neighbors searched the hillsides, volunteers flooded the streets, and the community clung to hope. The Smarts pleaded on television for their daughter's safe return. Days turned to weeks as leads vanished. Each dawn brought exhaustion, each night despair. Somewhere in the nearby mountains, Elizabeth breathed through fear, bound and stolen, her world reduced to the sound of wind and her own heartbeat. In the shadows of those mountains, her captor revealed himself, Brian David Mitchell, a self-proclaimed prophet who believed he was chosen to take young girls as wives in a twisted mission from God. With him was Wanda Barzee, his devoted follower and wife, a woman torn between obedience and madness. Mitchell had watched the Smart home for weeks, planning the abduction with chilling precision. To him, Elizabeth wasn't a child. She was a symbol of divine destiny. His delusions masked cruelty with scripture, his control disguised as faith. In his mind, the act was righteous. In reality, it was evil incarnate. Barzee followed his commands like scripture itself, believing her obedience would earn redemption. Together, they led Elizabeth into a wilderness prison where faith was distorted into torment and innocence was crucified by fanaticism. Elizabeth's first hours in captivity were a blur of fear and disbelief. Blindfolded and gagged, she stumbled through rocks and brush as Mitchell dragged her up the mountain. The cold night air bit into her skin, the sound of branches breaking beneath her feet echoing like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. When they reached the camp, a crude shelter of tarps and rope hidden in the pines, Mitchell bound her to a tree and declared she was now his chosen bride. Her mind spun in terror as his voice preached insanity dressed in holiness. She prayed silently, her tears soaking into the earth. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant owl, carried both hope and horror. Her world had collapsed into a circle of dirt, rope, and fear, and all she could do was survive each heartbeat that passed. The camp was a prison carved out of wilderness. Canvas tents stitched with grime and leaves stood like ghosts. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, decay, and illusion. Mitchell's holy sanctuary was nothing more than a trap of filth and fear. Days blurred into each other, marked by forced prayers, hunger, and manipulation. Elizabeth's wrists were raw from bindings, her voice silent from threat. The isolation was suffocating. Every sunrise mocked her with false promises of freedom. Mitchell's words twisted the Bible into a weapon, justifying every cruelty he inflicted. In the quiet of the forest, Elizabeth learned the language of survival. Silence, submission, and prayer whispered through clenched teeth. She was a captive of madness, yet somewhere deep inside, the spark of hope refused to die. Mitchell began his psychological war. He renamed Elizabeth Esther, erasing her identity as part of his twisted vision of purity and control. He spoke endlessly of his divine mission to prepare his followers for the apocalypse and to cleanse the world through suffering. Each day he preached, and each word chipped away at Elizabeth's sense of self. He told her that her family had forgotten her, that the world no longer searched, but in the secret corners of her heart, she clung to faith. She whispered prayers under her breath, holding onto the image of her parents' faces. Mitchell's voice thundered like prophecy, but his power thrived on her fear. Elizabeth began to understand. Survival meant learning his rules, pretending compliance, and waiting for the moment when faith might set her free. Down below, the Smart family refused to surrender. Ed and Lois Smart transformed their grief into relentless action. Flyers, interviews, vigils, their faces became symbols of endurance. The community's love for Elizabeth burned like a beacon, and strangers from across the country joined the search. Helicopters scoured the canyons, volunteers combed through fields, and news anchors spoke her name nightly. Every false lead felt like betrayal, every silence like death. But Lois refused to let her daughter's face fade from memory. She believed Elizabeth was alive, and that faith would one day bring her home. Hope, fragile but fierce, became the Smarts' weapon against despair. The investigation pressed on, tangled in confusion and dead ends. Early suspects, a handyman, a drifter, even family friends, filled police lists. Psychics claimed visions, strangers reported sightings. Still, no trace emerged. Then came the sketch. A bearded, ragged man once seen near the Smart home. Few took it seriously at first, yet that crude drawing sketched from a frightened memory would later crack the case wide open. As the weeks turned to months, detectives faced criticism for every failure, but they refused to quit. Somewhere, they believed, Elizabeth was still fighting to stay alive. They just didn't know how close or how far she really was. Elizabeth's world had become repetition, hunger, fear, forced prayers. Mitchell alternated between rage and revelation. He fasted for days, claiming visions, then demanded loyalty through cruelty. Elizabeth learned to read his moods, to anticipate his madness before it turned violent. At night, she stared through the cracks in the tent, dreaming of rescue, of her bedroom walls, of the scent of home. The wilderness became both her prison and her test of faith. She imagined her parents' voices, whispering courage into her dreams. Even as her body weakened, her spirit endured. She refused to let him erase her humanity. Wanda Barzee watched silently. Once a mother herself, she had become lost in Mitchell's delusion. Sometimes she scolded Elizabeth, other times she offered food or whispered a prayer beside her. Her devotion to Mitchell was both her weapon and her wound. Elizabeth saw in her eyes flashes of pity, tiny fractured pieces of a conscience that hadn't fully died. But those moments never lasted. Barzee always returned to obedience, fearing Mitchell's wrath more than her own guilt. To Elizabeth, Barzee was both tormentor and mirror, proof of what captivity could do to a soul trapped too long in fear. Months passed, the world outside moved on, but Elizabeth's world remained trapped in ritual. She learned to hide her thoughts, to nod when Mitchell spoke, to keep hope buried deep beneath submission. When he preached, she pretended belief. When he demanded obedience, she endured. Her survival became an act of quiet rebellion. In her silence, she was strong. Every day she told herself, I will live. I will see my family again. That unbroken thread of will became her weapon against despair. Mitchell believed he controlled her spirit, but in truth, she had already begun to reclaim it. One silent heartbeat at a time. The search continued across America. News networks replayed her picture endlessly, the blonde girl with bright eyes, missing for months. Thousands of tips poured in, stretching law enforcement thin. Psychics, criminals, and attention seekers all claimed to know her fate. Still, the Smarts pressed on, never letting the public forget. Elizabeth's name had become a prayer on every newscast, a haunting reminder of innocence stolen and hope unbroken. And yet behind the cameras, her family wept each night, clinging to faith that she was still somewhere waiting to be found. Mitchell's paranoia grew. Believing the end of days was near, he began moving Elizabeth and Barzee through towns, disguised in heavy robes and veils. Elizabeth's face was hidden, her voice forbidden. In public, she was inches from freedom, yet bound by fear. Once she passed by police officers in a library. Her heart raced as Mitchell's hand gripped her arm. The officers glanced at them but looked away, unaware that the girl they sought stood right before them. The officers glanced at them but looked away, unaware that the girl they sought stood right before them. She longed to scream but stayed silent. The memory of Mitchell's knife still burned into her mind. Survival meant silence, even in the light of hope. That near rescue haunted her. She realized freedom would come not through luck, but courage. Mitchell's delusions deepened. He claimed new visions, spoke of taking more wives. His sermons grew erratic, his mind unraveling. Elizabeth watched and waited, her strength quietly building. She knew his control was faltering. When he spoke of returning to Salt Lake City, she saw a sliver of destiny opening before her. She prayed that God would place the right eyes upon her at the right moment, that someone somehow would see past the disguise. They walked the streets of Sandy, Utah in March 2003. The sun burned through the clouds, exposing faces long hidden by robes. Mitchell rambled about prophecy while Elizabeth followed in silence, her heart pounding. Then it happened. A woman passing by stopped, staring. Something in Elizabeth's eyes seemed familiar. She called the police. Moments later, officers approached, calm but firm. "Are you Elizabeth Smart?" one asked. Silence. Mitchell barked denials, but the truth could no longer hide. Elizabeth, trembling, finally whispered, "Yes." The spell broke. 2 words ended 9 months of horror. The rescue was chaos wrapped in grace. Police led Elizabeth away as Mitchell shouted biblical verses. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, voices rising. But Elizabeth barely heard them. Tears fell freely as she saw her parents waiting at the station. The embrace was pure salvation. Months of terror melting into a single moment of peace. The world rejoiced, but the Smarts held her quietly as if afraid she might vanish again. In that moment, the nightmare ended, but healing had just begun. Elizabeth's voice, once stolen by fear, would soon become one of strength. Strength means. In the months that followed, the truth unfolded like a wound reopened. Mitchell and Barzee were arrested, their trials exposing years of delusion and cruelty. Mitchell ranted in court, declaring divine authority, while Barzee's face reflected the emptiness of remorse. The public learned of Elizabeth's courage, how she had endured, how she had survived through faith and cunning. Her family stood by her, shielding her from the storm of attention. And she returned to the world changed but unbroken. The darkness had not consumed her. It had revealed her strength. Years later, Elizabeth Smart stood before cameras again, this time by choice. No longer a victim, she became an advocate for the missing, the silenced, the stolen. She spoke of resilience, of forgiveness, of faith that outlasts fear. Her story became a testament that even in the deepest night, hope can survive. The name Elizabeth Smart no longer belonged to tragedy. It belonged to triumph. Through her courage, thousands found inspiration, and a nation learned that even in the face of evil, light endures.